Hi all. So today we're going to look at N. Scott Mamaday and the preface of his much noted novel House Made of Dawn. It deals with his sacred land, memory layers, and storytelling. So who is this N. Scott Mamaday? He was born in the year 1934. He's a foundational figure in the Native American Renaissance, a literary movement that brought indigenous voices to mainstream American literature. And Mamaday was a novelist, poet, painter, memoirist, and a scholar of Kiowa descent. He was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, and he was the first person to be recognized, a first Native American writer to be recognized by the American literary establishment. Now, Momaday's unique literary voice blends indigenous oral traditions and mythic structures, making it more lyrical in English prose. And it creates a kind of a distinctive bridge between ancient storytelling and modern narrative forms. So his contributions to literature are many, and we see that he, through his literary contributions, he has preserved indigenous knowledge systems. He also has established themes of identity and belonging, and he tries to heal through tradition and storytelling, something quite different. And he also balances or strikes a balance between indigenous culture with modernity. Now, let's look at the early life and cultural foundation of Scott Mamaday. As I told you earlier, he was born in 1934 in Lawton, Oklahoma, in the southwest. So, Mamaday grew up immersed in the rich cultural tapestry of the American Southwest, particularly in New Mexico and Arizona. And regarding his parents, both of them were educators, and they were the ones who fostered his early exposure to diverse native communities, including the Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo traditions. So, as a child, Scott Momaday had great experiences that he garnered from Jemez Pueblo. So, in him, his experiences there instilled in him a deep reverence for tribal ceremonies, sacred landscapes, and ancestral stories. So, according to Momaday, the land and its people became the foundation of my storytelling. So, these are his own words. And now, looking at his educational background and influences, as we saw earlier, his parents were educational influences. So, both being educators, they exposed him to diverse native communities and knowledge systems, and these became the foundation, or they served as the base for his later literary work. Now, talking about Navajo traditions, exposure to Navajo traditions and ceremonies and storytelling methods helped in emphasizing harmony and balance, that is to say, the Hozo concept, which is the core of the Navajo traditions. Then you have the Apache heritage. Now, when he was connected to the Apache oral traditions, he was able to look at the importance of historical memory also, and that had influenced Scott Momaday a lot. And now, talking about the Pueblo influence, you find that he has a deep reverence for Pueblo communal rhythms and spiritual connection to the land. Now, Scott Momaday seemed to have spent most of his formative years in Jemez Pueblo, and it is that has helped him appreciate the Pueblo tribal ceremonies, sacred landscapes, ancestral stories, and all of these became the spiritual bedrock of his writing. So that's very important. Now, such a great writer, such a renowned writer who has brought together his communal experiences and the richness of his own native traditions have really helped him win many accolades. And so, Pulitzer Prize is one of them. And he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in the year 1968 for his novel House Made of Dawn. And that's the first major recognition of a Native American writer by American literary establishment. The book was published in the year 1968 and the prize was awarded in the year 1969. Yeah, I'm sorry, earlier I told you the prize was awarded, but the prize was awarded in the year 1969. So what are the historical significances of this work? You find that this sparked the Native American Renaissance in literature, thus opening doors for subsequent indigenous authors. And it established Native American voices in mainstream American literature. It also helped in preserving indigenous knowledge systems through literary excellence. So this achievement is widely credited with sparking the Native American Renaissance in literature and opening, as I told you, doors for subsequent indigenous authors who focused on their own tribes, their own native communities. So now what is this about the Native American Renaissance? It was a literary movement that brought forth the indigenous voices, or I should say amplified the indigenous voices, and thus gelled them well with the mainstream American literature. And by doing so, there was a distinct native perspective created in contemporary letters. So it had a cultural impact, as we saw earlier. The Native American perspectives were elevated in the literary circles, and they also brought in enduring themes of identity and belonging. So Mamaday's debut novel, House Made of Dawn, as we know, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in the year 1969, and it was a major literary recognition that brought in increased visibility, and it served as a launchpad for an important literary movement, that is the Native American Renaissance. So what are the core themes in Mamaday's work in general? Identity and belonging. Through his works, he explores the struggle of the individuals who are caught between traditional and indigenous life and modern American society. And you find that the novel's characters, especially the House Made of Dawn, grapple with finding home in a world that offers no place for them. And his works most often connect to the land, and they associate a sanctity to it, emphasizing particularly on the spiritual and cultural ties between the native peoples and their ancestral lands. So for Mamaday, the landscape of the American Southwest is not merely a scenery but the origin of the narrative. And this is quite interesting. We know that he is bent upon creating healing through traditions. So his literary works are therapeutic in nature. So they highlight the restorative power of ancestral knowledge in overcoming trauma and cultural loss. So the stories are healing, or they have the healing impact or healing effect. They connect human beings to the land. They reaffirm identity and enact cultural continuity. And not just that, his works in general, they also focus on the conflict between the cultures, especially Mamaday tries to address the psychological wounds faced by the Native Americans due to displacement. That's the major challenge that they faced, almost all of them. And then the cultural erosion and self-determination, and all of these were struggles that they had to really encounter. So this particular novel, The House Made of Dawn, captures the tension between traditional indigenous life and the fragmentation of modern America. So let's understand the preface. Scott Mamaday has allocated specific space for the preface where he talks in detail about the whatever he wants to say about the housemaid of dawn and its making. So, the preface of this novel serves as a contemplative and poetic gateway into the world of the novel. So, it guides the readers to approach the text with an understanding of its indigenous foundations. The preface functions as a spiritual and cultural guide, preparing readers for the profound themes that are explored within the work. As I told you, the preface is a gateway because it explains the spiritual and cultural roots from which the novel springs. It also guides the readers to approach the text with appreciation for its deep indigenous foundations because many of them do not know about the Native Americans. And it establishes the preface as a gateway to understand the novel's sacred geography. That's very important because only when you understand the geography can you understand what Mamaday wants to really convey about it. So the first aspect is the land, their own land is very sacred and the landscape is a source of the story. Then we have layers of memory that are documented or chronicled in the novel. And the layers of memory are personal, ancestral, and tribal as a community also. So, and all of these are expressed or articulated through a wonderful or a gripping storytelling method, which is a sacred ceremonial act of all these Native Americans. So now let's look at land as a source of story. Mamaday posits that the landscape of the American Southwest is not merely a backdrop, but it is the fundamental wellspring of the narrative itself. So, the land in this view is a repository of memory, and the writer serves as its interpreter, in Mamaday's words. So, for Mamaday, stories seem to be emerging from the land and are imparted to those who possess the capacity for deep listening. So, what are the sacred elements of the southwest landscape? First, the sacred mountains. They are holistic spiritual symbols representing the foundation of native cosmology. Then we have the desert light. The desert light are said to be too harsh, clear light, revealing truth and transforming the ordinary into the sacred. Then we have the ancient stone that silently witnesses or bears testimony to history, that holds stories not just of an individual but of past generations. So that's one of the sacred elements of the southwest landscape. And then the most important one is the shifting sky. You find that there is an ever changing canopy that connects the earth to cosmos and marks the passage of time. So you'll have to be so observant. And so to consider all of these elements of the southwest landscape sacred, one needs to be in proximity with nature, and that's what all of these Native Americans do. And now the geography of memory. For Mamaday, Jemes Pueblos's geography is inextricably woven or closely knit into the housemaid of dawn, and it serves as the foundation of the narrative. So, as we saw earlier, the sacred mountains, he talks about the towering peaks of Jemes Pueblo because that region represents spiritual landmarks that shape the novel's emotional landscape. Now, focusing on the next sacred element, the desert light, we find that the healing light of the southwest desert illuminates the protagonist Abel's journey and helps him connect to ceremonial experiences. Then we have the ancient stone. There is a weathered stone formations that hold memories of past generations, not one or two, but many past generations. And this ancient stone serve as anchors for cultural identity. So the land in this view, as I told you earlier, again I would like to reiterate, is a repository of memory and the writer is the interpreter. So there is a connection that takes place between the land and memory. So there is a specific geography, that is James Pueblo's landscape, that forms the novel's emotional core. Okay, and we saw that the ancient stone and the sacred sites are connected to ancestral memory, triggering out historical significance. The landscape also evokes deep emotional responses that shape the narrative in a very enticing manner, and so there is an emotional resonance. Now, what are the three layers of memory? We had a look at it, a peek into it initially. Now, Mamaday reveals that the house made of dawn is constructed from three distinct yet interconnected layers of memory, and that makes the novel a distinctive blend of realism, symbolism, and mythic depth. So, let's first look at the personal memory. In the novel, you find Momaday's childhood experiences and impressions of Pueblo life, including the ceremonies, communal rhythms, and the wisdom of elders, being the initial inspiration of the story. Then, eventually, you find that the ancestral memory is documented here. As a Kiowa writer, Mamaday carries the historical narratives and traditions of his people, which profoundly influence his imagination and moral perspective. So it doesn't stop with that, he moves to the past. And when he moves to the past, he looks at the ancestors. Now, it's not just to a particular group of people, but he looks at them as communities, as a collective whole. So he comes on to the tribal memory, that's to say the indigenous communities that maintain and transmit knowledge through rich oral traditions. And the oral traditions are stories, songs, and rituals, and they serve as tools of connections that connect generations and ensure cultural identity. So these intertwined layers imbue the novel with its distinctive blend of realism, symbolism, and mythic depth, thus creating a tapestry that reflects Native American experience that is worth reading. So now, focusing on the personal memory, the childhood foundations. Momaday's childhood experiences in the James Pueblo became the spiritual foundation of his writing. We know that, we just got to look into it in the earlier slides, and these experiences form the earliest seeds of House Made of Dawn. He himself says, "My childhood impressions of Pueblo life, its ceremonies, communal rhythms, and elders formed the earliest seeds of the story." So his personal memories include the ceremonial aspects of Pueblo culture, the communal rhythms of village life, the wisdom and stories of the elders. So let's now focus on the sacred geography. The specific geography of James Pueblo became inseparable from the novel's emotional and spiritual core. Then we also get to hear the ceremonial rhythms that are carefully and meticulously carved into the novel. And the communal ceremonies and their sacred rhythms became embedded in this understanding of the storytelling. Then, of course, the elders' wisdom are carefully etched out and embedded in the story or in the novel. The oral traditions and wisdom of the elders provided the moral and spiritual framework for his narratives. So now let's look at the ancestral memory, that's to say the Kiowa heritage. So as a Kiowa writer, Mamaday carries the historical narratives and traditions of his people, which profoundly influences imagination and moral perspective. Now let's look at the Kiowa historical narratives. They focus on the historical continuity which the Kiowa people maintained through oral histories that connected past to present, and that helped in shaping Mamaday's understanding of time and narrative. Then the historical narratives of the Kiowa also serve as the moral compass, because it talks about the Kiowa ethical systems and values that they had internalized, and these internalized values guide Momaday's moral framework and literary vision. Then now moving on to the imaginative influence, the mythic structures were of great influence on Mamaday. Kiowa creation stories and mythic patterns provided Mamaday with narrative frameworks, and these frameworks transcended cultural boundaries. And of course, the ceremonial knowledge also. The sacred rituals and ceremonies of the Kiowa people became central elements in Mamaday's literary works, particularly in his novel The House Made of Dawn. So now, looking at the tribal memory or the collective preservation, we find that the tribal memory or the collective memory serves as or represents the shared knowledge and experiences of indigenous communities. So it doesn't focus on one particular individual or just a little small group, but it focuses on the indigenous community as a whole. So that is maintained. Their memory is maintained through rich oral traditions. We all know that these native traditions had oral traditions only, and that was passed down through generations. So this has been helpful in connecting the past with the present as well as the future generation, and this helps in enabling continuity of cultural identity, and it provides emotional and spiritual guidance also. So we see that there is a kind of a cultural continuity, and that cultural continuity is sustained, nurtured or propagated through stories, songs, rituals and community that serve to connect generations and ensure the continuity of cultural identity. So now storytelling, let's look at the storytelling as a sacred ceremony. In native worldviews, storytelling transcends mere entertainment. It's a sacred and ceremonial act. And storytelling in native culture is a profound spiritual practice that connects the individuals not to the people alone, but to the land, to the environment that surrounds them, to each other, as well as to the sacred. Religious aspects are also associated with it. So it serves as a vehicle for healing, cultural transmission, and maintaining balance. So storytelling heals individuals and communities. Now, you find that the center of storytelling ceremonies is the sacred fire. And stories always connect human beings to the land, and it kind of fosters a sense of belonging. And that is what triggers their sense of we feeling. Okay, and these stories reaffirm their identity and it strengthens their cultural bonds. So the House Made of Dawn adopts the cadences of ceremonial speech. You'll find that throughout the novel. So there are four functions of the stories. In native tradition, stories serve important or key functions, and they are not just sources of entertainment but they act as powerful tools of healing, connection, identity and continuity. So when we see healing, stories tend to heal individuals and communities by restoring balance, addressing their trauma and providing understanding of suffering and recovery. So now we see that these stories also help human beings to be connected to their land, and by doing so they foster a kind of profound sense of belonging and stewardship of the natural world. Now let's look into how they help in reaffirming their identity. Stories strengthen cultural bonds and self-understanding, thus they help individuals and communities understand who they are and how they relate to others. And as we saw earlier, stories ensure the transmission of traditions across generations through their oral traditions, and thus they connect the past with the future, and when they do so, they maintain the cultural identity. So, stories are not simply entertainment but a sacred and ceremonial act. Now, ceremonial speech patterns. You find that Mamaday has designed House Made of Dawn to resonate or echo with ceremonial speech patterns, and thereby he transforms narrative into spiritual experiences. So, the novel is intended to be experienced not solely as a work of fiction but as a spiritual journey. You find rhythmic cadences, that is to say, repetitive patterns that echo ceremonial chants. Then you have prayerful language. Lyrical prose that invokes spiritual resonances can be heard from the novel. Then you have ceremonial elements in narrative. There is a musical structure, so the novel adopts the flow of traditional songs and chants. There is a circular narrative. The stories that reflect cyclical time of indigenous worldviews are recorded here. Land is featured and they echo spiritual significance of the ceremonies. The narrative structure mirrors ceremonial progression. So the novel invites the readers into a contemplative journey, and so the stories are not just stories of entertainment, but they are the rhythms of our days, says Mamaday. So now there is also an identity conflict in modern America that these Native Americans face, and that is also documented here. You find that there is a contrast in the lifestyle between the traditional indigenous life and the modern fragmentation of the modernized America. So there is a connection to ancestral lands and sacred geography. There is a community-centered existence with defined roles in the traditional indigenous life, and it is loaded with oral traditions and ceremonial practices. And you know that these Native Americans or the traditional indigenous people, they live a harmonious life with the natural world and the seasonal cycles, which are altogether in contrast to the modern America, which is fragmented, where they experience displacement from ancestral territories. Okay, that's very important. They feel that they are displaced from their ancestral boundaries or territories, and there's a kind of an individualism that seems to be overriding the communal values that they had internalized or imbibed from their own communities. They also experience a loss of cultural language and traditions, and in a continued fashion, they seem to be engaged in search for identity in this rapidly changing society. So that is what you find with the protagonist of House Made of Dawn. He's Abel, and he experiences this cultural collision or conflict, creating a profound inner conflict that drives the narrative. So there is a tension between belonging and displacement that becomes the emotional core of Momaday's masterpiece. So the conflicts becomes the heart of the novel's emotional journey. Besides this, there are also psychological wounds and displacement that are recorded. So Mamaday hints that the book arises from the tension between the traditional indigenous life and the fragmentation of modern America. So it's not just a physical tension, it is also a psychological one, affecting them at the cultural level because the traditional ways of life are broken apart due to displacement. They also experience trauma because there is a psychological impact of being uprooted from their ancestral lands, and they have the crisis of belongingness. They struggle to find place both physically and culturally, and they are torn between their communal geography and the modern geography. So Momaday's literary response through House Made of Dawn is that he tries to heal these wounds by all of these. What are they? By preserving memory against cultural amnesia, by elevating native stories within the literary landscape, by ensuring continuity of sacred traditions, and by creating a space for cultural reclamation. So, what are the real life influences in authenticity? In Preface, Mamaday acknowledges that this novel is grounded in real people and experiences from his time in New Mexico. He says, hunters, runners, elders, and storytellers from his life contributed to the novel's world, serving as teachers who shaped his understanding of tradition, silence, ritual, and endurance. So, this grounding in lived experience or phenomenological experience provides a powerful and genuine portrayal of the challenges and resilience with native communities. There are many authentic elements in the novel. There are many real characters from whom he has drawn his fictional characters, and these real characters he seemed to have met in New Mexico. Then the scenes are grounded in specific locations from the American Southwest. Rituals and traditions are portrayed with authenticity and respect. And then the storytelling methods also echo ceremonial speech patterns from New Mexico. So Mamaday makes writing as a form of cultural preservation and authenticity. And we see that he seems to be honoring teachers and mentors also, whom he met in New Mexico. And these are people who shaped his understanding of tradition, silence, ritual, and endurance. So hunters, wisdom from those who track not just game but knowledge, taught Mamaday the art of observation and patience, as well as precision. Then the runners, those who carry messages and maintain connection between communities, they showed Mamaday the power of communication, because there were people who used to be kind of couriers. They used to move from one community to another. So he learnt connection and journey from them. Then from the elders, he inculcated wisdom and heritage, because these elders were the wise ones who possess accumulated knowledge and cultural memory, and they provided guidance on tradition and wisdom. And with regard to the storytellers, he considered them to be the keepers on oral tradition who transmit cultural knowledge through narratives, teaching Mamaday the power of storytelling, that is to say, tradition and continuity. He honors them as teachers who shaped his understanding of all of these. Right? So now he considered writing as cultural preservation, which means to say a critical means of preserving indigenous identity in the face of historical and ongoing attempts to erase it. Survival of memory. He preserves personal and collective memory against the threat of cultural amnesia, and thus he ensures that stories and experiences are not lost. Then he elevates the native stories within the broader literary landscape, and thereby he gives them the respect and visibility they deserve in American literature. He ensures the transmission of sacred tradition to future generations by maintaining the spiritual and cultural essence of indigenous heritage. So through literature, he seeks to ensure the survival of memory, the dignity of native stories, and the continuity. Please note, the dignity of native stories and the continuity of sacred traditions. In this sense, House Made of Dawn is an act of cultural reclamation as much as a work of art. So he tried to preserve his culture through literary experiences. And he undertakes a profound act of cultural reclamation. Okay? And by doing so, it is an artistic achievement also, because the novel's literary merit lies in its fusion of indigenous oral traditions with modern narrative forms, and thus it creates a unique voice bridging ancient storytelling with contemporary literature. And when Mamaday tells native stories on his own terms, he seems to be reclaiming the narrative form from colonial perspectives, elevating indigenous experiences and within the broader literary landscape. And this is one point that I've been continuously reiterating. The novel is also a testament to Native American heritage, and which ensures that sacred traditions and collective memory survive despite historical attempts at erasure. So the novel's ceremonial language and spiritual themes constitute a form of cultural resistance which preserves the sacred dimensions of indigenous identity that colonialism seeks to erase or diminish. So in this sense, House Made of Dawn is an act of cultural reclamation, and it's not just a work of art. So the novel's essential elements are sacred geography, oral tradition, tribal memory, identity conflict, and ceremonial healing. These are things that we've been talking about so far. And what is the legacy and impact? We saw that this is the first work, or he's the first writer to be recognized by the American literary establishment through the prize conferred upon him. Hope you have understood what has been taught so far. If so, and if you feel you need to take a quiz on it, here is a quiz that has been generated through Questionwell. You can click on it or scan it to take a quiz to know how much you have understood through this video. Thank you once again for your patient watching.